1. Shock hooked, the chamber was thick with tension when it happened. Mike Lee, armed with years of practiced arrogance, leaned in with the kind of smirk that always assumed he had the final word. And then, calmly, firmly, and without raising her voice, Jasmine Crockett let loose the line that cut sharper than any gavel, sharper than any headline. One sentence, one strike. The kind of line that doesn't just end a debate, it rewrites the narrative. The words fell, and for a split second, there was silence. Not the ordinary hush of procedure, but a silence so heavy it seemed to rattle the very air. Eyes darted across the chamber. Some jaws dropped. Others struggled to suppress smirks. And then it began, the audible gasp from the gallery, the sound of cameras clicking furiously, the muffled laughter that spilled over into whispers. In that instant, the balance of power shifted, and everyone knew it. Mike Lee blinked, his practiced composure faltering for the first time. He had been the seasoned senator, the lawyer's lawyer, the man who had made a career out of lecturing others into submission. But in that moment, he looked small. The line Crockett delivered was not just a retort. It was a mirror held up to his hypocrisy, a truth so piercing it needed no elaboration. And yet, what made the moment seismic wasn't only what she said, it was what it represented. A young black congresswoman, standing toe-to-toe with a veteran Republican senator, refusing to yield, refusing to shrink, and in a single sentence, reminding America that truth can sound like thunder even when spoken softly. The chamber would never forget it. Neither would the millions who would soon see the clip replayed across every screen in the country. But to truly understand why that one line hit with the force of an earthquake, why it traveled beyond the walls of Congress and into the bloodstream of the national conversation, we need to rewind. We need to trace the arrogance that set the stage and the resilience that prepared Crockett for this exact moment. Because this wasn't just a clapback. It was the undoing of years of arrogance. Point 2. Raise the stakes. To see why this moment mattered, we have to step back and recognize who was in the arena. Mike Lee isn't just another senator. He's a conservative mainstay, a man who has spent years branding himself as the guardian of constitutional purity, the polished intellectual who cloaks hardline partisanship in the language of law. When Mike Lee speaks, his words carry the weight of the establishment, an establishment that has long dictated who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and who gets dismissed as irrelevant noise. That's why the clash with Jasmine Crockett felt so electric. This wasn't simply a war of words. It was a symbolic standoff between two visions of America. On one side stood Lee, the embodiment of the old guard, powerful, entrenched, wielding the authority of years and the privilege of pedigree. On the other stood Crockett, a freshman representative, a black woman from Texas, dismissed by many in Washington as inexperienced, too bold, too unapologetically herself. For Lee, sparring with her might have seemed routine, a chance to swat down a rising voice before it gained altitude. But for Crockett, the stakes were far greater. Every word she spoke carried the weight of the community she represented. Immigrants, working families, people of color who had long been told to wait their turn. And in that chamber, where hierarchy rules and power often feels untouchable, she refused to bend. That refusal mattered. It mattered because democracy itself is not just about laws on paper, but about who gets to shape the narrative, whose truths are amplified, and whose voices are silenced. Lee's posture that day was about more than policy. It was about maintaining the myth that power belongs only to those who have always held it. Crockett's answer, distilled into one savage line, shattered that myth in real time. It was a reminder that representation is not cosmetic, it is disruptive. It unsettles those who thought the room would forever echo only their voices. For progressives watching, it was a validation of something deeply personal, that dignity could still stand tall against arrogance, that a freshman could face a senator and refuse to be minimized. And for those on the sidelines, who may not have known Crockett's story, it was an introduction to a figure unwilling to let hypocrisy pass unchallenged. The stakes weren't just Crockett versus Lee. They were about whether the America of privilege and pretense would continue unchecked, or whether a new generation, diverse, unafraid, unapologetic, would force the nation to listen. The room may have seen it as a skirmish of words, but outside those walls, people saw a larger question. Can truth still break through when arrogance has had the microphone for decades? The answer was about to unfold. Because what began as a sharp exchange would soon become a defining moment, one that rippled far beyond Washington and into living rooms, timelines, and conversations across the country. And the moment was about to escalate into something no one could ignore. 3. Antagonist backstory. Mike Lee got to understand why Jasmine Crockett's words landed like a lightning strike. You have to understand the man they were aimed at. Mike Lee has built his career on a very particular image. One of the principled constitutionalists, the man who claims to stand above the swamp of petty politics, a senator whose every move is supposedly grounded in the letter of America's founding documents. He speaks with the cadence of certainty, wielding phrases like original intent and limited government, as though they are shields no one dare pierce. For years, that posture has given him power, the aura of an untouchable statesman, the intellectual backbone of the conservative movement. But beneath that polished exterior lies a pattern that critics know all too well. Lee's career has been defined by obstructionism, not advancement, by tearing down rather than building up. He has made headlines less for bipartisan solutions and more for stonewalling progress, wrapping every act of defiance in the language of liberty. To his supporters, he is a defender of freedom. To his critics, he is a gatekeeper of inequality, using lofty rhetoric to justify keeping doors closed to those who have never had a fair shot at entering. The contradictions run deep. Mike Lee positions himself as a guardian of free speech, yet he has shown little patience when that speech challenges his worldview. He champions the sanctity of family values, yet aligns himself with movements and leaders who trample on the very dignity of families struggling at the margins. He rails against government overreach, while voting to entrench systems that allow corporations and the wealthy to dictate the lives of ordinary Americans. In every contradiction, one thing remains constant: Mike Lee's ability to present himself as the calm authority in the room, the man too clever to be unmasked. That is what makes him intimidating. He doesn't shout. He smirks. He doesn't storm out. He waits, certain that time and hierarchy are on his side. His power lies in the performance of inevitability, that whatever challenge rises against him will eventually collapse under his seasoned composure. It is a strategy that has worked countless times. Opponents have walked into debates thinking they could outmatch him, only to find themselves tangled in his legalistic phrasing, drowned out by his ability to manipulate procedure, or dismissed by his deliberate pauses that signal superiority without saying a word. For years, Mike Lee has thrived in this role. The senator who wears elitism like armor, who makes opponents feel smaller simply by making them wait for his answer. And for much of his career, the tactic has been effective. Few dared to challenge him head-on, and fewer still managed to leave a mark that lasted beyond the news cycle. He was, in many ways, untouchable, a figure who represented not just his own ideology but the towering weight of entrenched power in Washington. But arrogance has a way of blinding even the most seasoned players. Because beneath that calm exterior, Lee carried the assumption that he could not be rattled, that his experience alone guaranteed victory in any exchange. He believed that a freshman lawmaker, especially one like Jasmine Crockett, could be brushed aside with the same condescension he had used against others. To him, this was just another routine sparring match, another chance to reinforce his dominance in front of cameras and colleagues alike. What he didn't see was that Crockett wasn't stepping into his arena as a guest. She was claiming it. And she wasn't there to play by the unspoken rules that had long protected men like him. She was there to break them. Mike Lee's confidence was his shield, but it was also his greatest weakness. Because when you are certain you cannot be defeated, you stop looking for the blow that can undo you. And that was exactly the mistake he made in that chamber. But Lee's confidence blinded him to the storm waiting in Jasmine Crockett. 4. Protagonist backstory. Jasmine Crockett. Long before she stood in the chamber facing down Mike Lee, Jasmine Crockett had already lived a life defined by resistance. Born and raised in Texas, she knew firsthand what it meant to come from a place where the odds weren't always stacked in your favor. She wasn't born into a political dynasty or groomed for power in marble hallways. Her path was different. It began with the quiet, relentless decision to fight for people who had no one else to fight for them. As a young lawyer, Crockett carved out a reputation for herself in courtrooms that most politicians never set foot in. These weren't glamorous stages or high-profile trials that ended up on the front page. These were the cases of everyday people. The single mother threatened with eviction, the teenager railroaded by a justice system that too often punished skin color more than crime, the worker cheated out of wages by an employer who assumed no one would care. For Crockett, the law wasn't an abstract debate. It was a weapon she wielded to level the playing field. Even when the playing field seemed impossibly tilted, again and again, she faced the machinery of a system designed to silence the voiceless. And again, she refused to yield. Those courtrooms became her training ground. Every hostile cross-examination, every eye roll from a judge who underestimated her, every smirk from an opposing attorney who assumed she'd fold, each moment hardened her resolve. Each battle taught her not just how to argue, but how to endure, how to carry the weight of communities that had been ignored and still push forward. Her journey into politics wasn't born out of ambition, but necessity. She saw the limits of what she could accomplish case by case, and she realized the fight had to move to a larger arena. Running for office was never about personal glory. It was about scaling the fight, turning the lessons she had learned in courtrooms into policies that could reshape lives on a broader scale. When she ran for Congress, she wasn't polished in the way Washington often expects. She was raw, unapologetic, and real. And that authenticity resonated with people who were tired of politicians rehearsing empathy, but never living in Washington. Crockett quickly became known not for quiet assimilation, but for bold defiance. She didn't smooth her edges to make others comfortable. She didn't lower her voice to blend in. She spoke the way she always had, direct, passionate, unflinching. To some, that made her controversial. To others, it made her indispensable. Because in every committee hearing, in every debate, in every exchange with those who thought their titles granted them automatic respect, Crockett reminded people that democracy was supposed to belong to everyone, not just the powerful. What truly set her apart was her refusal to be silenced. Time and again, women, especially women of color, are told in subtle and overt ways to sit down, to wait, to temper their tone. Crockett refused all of it. She carried into Congress the same fire she had carried into courtrooms, and she used it not just to speak, but to confront. When she saw hypocrisy, she called it. When she saw corruption, she named it. And when she saw arrogance, she broke it down. That is why her clash with Mike Lee was never just about one line or one debate. It was the culmination of years of preparation, years of facing down condescension and dismissiveness, and still standing taller every time. Crockett's power wasn't rooted in seniority or political machinery. It was rooted in experience. Experience that had taught her how to speak truth even when the room was designed not to hear it. For those who had followed her journey, the moment with Lee was no surprise. They had seen this side of her before. The fighter who didn't shrink from conflict, but leaned into it with conviction. For those who hadn't, it was a revelation. It was the unveiling of a leader forged not in privilege, but in struggle. And so, when Mike Lee assumed he was sparring with a freshman destined to wilt under his authority, he was gravely mistaken. Crockett wasn't intimidated by his years in office, his polished tone, or his reputation. She had spent her life dismantling myths of superiority, one case, one battle, one confrontation at a time. These battles, these scars, this relentless insistence on dignity, they all converged in that chamber. They gave her the composure to stand firm, the clarity to slice through hypocrisy, and the confidence to deliver a single sentence that reverberated across the country. These battles forged the weapon Mike Lee would never see coming: her voice. 5. Debate escalation. That the chamber was alive with a restless energy, the kind that hovers in the air before a storm. Conversations were hushed but charged, eyes darting between the two figures who had become the center of gravity. On one side sat Mike Lee, radiating his usual composure, a man who had played this game so many times he could afford to appear unbothered. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, shoulders squared, gaze steady, not a hint of retreat in her posture. The audience leaned in, not because they expected a clash, but because they could feel one already brewing. It began the way these exchanges often do, with interruptions. Lee, armed with the polished cadence of a man who has spent years cloaking dismissiveness in civility, cut across Crockett mid-sentence. He did it casually, almost offhandedly, as if her words didn't merit the courtesy of completion. He smiled as he did it, The kind of smile that wasn't warm but calculated, a reminder of hierarchy, of seniority, of power. Crockett didn't flinch. She let him finish, her silence deliberate, her eyes steady on him. But when she began again, the same pattern repeated. Another interruption, this time tinged with condescension, as if he were explaining the rules of governance to a student who had wandered into the wrong classroom. The chamber noticed. Whispers fluttered through the rows. Some leaned back, smirking, certain they knew how this would play out. The veteran would lecture, the freshman would fold, but Crockett didn't fold. She listened. She absorbed. She let every word hang in the air, let every smirk carve itself into the moment, let every patronizing phrase weigh against him, not her. And in her restraint, she shifted the balance. The silence she held between his interruptions wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It allowed everyone in the room to feel the arrogance dripping from his tone, to recognize the imbalance he thought he could mask as routine debate. The tension thickened with each exchange. Every time Lee leaned forward, gesturing with the certainty of someone who thought he was closing the argument, Crockett leaned back, her composure unshaken. It was the clash of styles, his condescension against her calm, that gave the room its charge. The more he pushed, the more obvious his arrogance became. And the more she withheld, the more the room began to shift its focus from his authority to her poise. By the third interruption, even those who had entered the chamber with little interest in the exchange felt their attention sharpen. Something was unfolding. It wasn't just about policy or procedure anymore. It was about tone, about respect, about whether dignity could withstand arrogance without raising its voice. Every pause between them was electric. Every glance toward Crockett was filled with the unspoken question, how long would she take this? And then, the stillness in her posture gave the answer. Crockett wasn't taking it. She was measuring it. She was letting him build the very tower of arrogance she was about to topple. The tension in the room was no longer about what Lee was saying. It was about what Crockett was about to unleash. People could feel it. They could sense that her silence wasn't surrender but preparation. Then came the moment that flipped the entire atmosphere. Point 6. The mic drop counterattacked. The room was suspended in silence, heavy with the residue of Mike Lee's interruptions. He had spoken with the swagger of someone convinced his authority was unshakable, layering condescension upon dismissal until the chamber itself seemed to sag under the weight of his certainty. All eyes turned toward Jasmine Crockett. Would she bite back? Would she raise her voice? Would she let his arrogance dominate the air? She didn't. She took her time. A breath. A pause. Her gaze leveled at him with an intensity that cut sharper than any rebuttal yet spoken. The silence stretched, and in that moment, she controlled the room. Everyone waited. Everyone leaned in. Mike Lee, mistaking her patience for hesitation, smirked again, a man convinced he had already won. And then, with a calmness that carried more force than any shout, Crockett delivered the line. A single sentence, spoken not in rage but in clarity, each word measured, deliberate, and piercing. It wasn't long, it wasn't embellished, and it wasn't dressed in the jargon of politics. It was raw truth, delivered with such precision that it hit harder than any monologue Lee could have rehearsed. The line landed like a thunderclap. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze. No papers shuffled, no voices whispered. Just stunned stillness. Then came the collective intake of breath, the gasps, the low ripple of astonished murmurs threading through the rows. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against notepads, cameras whirred, flashes lit the air. Even the staffers, accustomed to the theatrics of congressional sparring, couldn't hide their wide-eyed shock. Mike Lee's expression shifted instantly. The smirk collapsed. His lips pressed tight, his face reddened, the practiced composure unraveling in real time. He tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat, stuck behind the realization that the room was no longer his. For years, he had dictated the terms of debate, lectured from the perch of seniority, basked in the security of unchallenged authority. But in this moment, all of it slipped away. Crockett's line did more than silence him. It dismantled him. It stripped the authority from his tone, the weight from his title, the smugness from his posture. In one sentence, she had drawn a line of truth so undeniable that it left his years of polished rhetoric crumbling like ash. And everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. The reaction was immediate and uncontrollable. Some in the chamber couldn't suppress laughter, the kind that breaks through tension like a crack of light in a storm. Others covered their mouths, trying to hide their shock. Allies leaned forward, grins spreading across their faces, as though they had just witnessed the impossible. Opponents shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another, aware that the narrative had slipped beyond their grasp. Reporters rushed to text their editors. Clips were already being uploaded, captions drafted, headlines forming. Crockett shuts down Lee with one savage line. Within minutes, the moment would ripple beyond the chamber and flood social media. But here, in the room where it happened, the impact was raw, immediate, undeniable. Mike Lee attempted to salvage the exchange. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie, leaned forward as though ready to regain control. But the weight of the silence that followed Crockett's words crushed every attempt. No matter what he said next, the damage was done. His authority had been punctured. His presence had been diminished. And the audience wasn't waiting for his recovery. They were still replaying her words in their minds, still savoring the shift they had just witnessed. Crockett didn't press further. She didn't gloat, didn't add insult to injury. She didn't need to. Her restraint made the line even more devastating. By refusing to stretch it into a speech, she let the sentence stand alone, echoing louder because it didn't compete with anything else. She had landed the blow and stepped back, allowing the weight of it to speak for itself. That's what made it cinematic. The pacing, the pause, the stillness before the strike, and the eruption that followed. It was a moment tailored not just for the chamber, but for history, the kind of confrontation that gets replayed endlessly because it contains everything: arrogance, resistance, truth, and collapse that in that one sentence. Jasmine Crockett didn't just rebut an argument. She shattered an illusion. She reminded everyone watching that power doesn't always belong to the loudest voice, the oldest title, or the most polished resume. Sometimes, power belongs to the one willing to speak the truth with unflinching clarity. And for Mike Lee, it was devastating. His authority, built carefully over years, had unraveled in seconds. His confidence, his smirk, his composure, all stripped away under the weight of Crockett's line. The chamber had seen it. The nation would soon see it. And he would not recover easily from the blow, because in one sentence, Jasmine Crockett dismantled Mike Lee's authority. 7. The aftermath shockwaves that the moment Crockett's words landed, the chamber erupted into a spectrum of reactions. Some observers leaned back, mouths slightly agape, struggling to process what had just happened. Others erupted into restrained applause, clapping quietly at first, then louder as if the act of recognition could make sense of the seismic shift they had just witnessed. And then there were those whose faces darkened in fury, the kind of anger that comes from seeing power challenged in ways they never anticipated. Whispers spread through the gallery like wildfire, every eye tracking Crockett and Lee as though the room itself had been transformed into a theater of tension and revelation. Reporters scrambled for their phones, capturing the reaction in real time. The chamber's cameras hummed as operators zoomed in on every expression, every subtle change in posture, every fleeting glance that revealed shock, delight, or disbelief. Within moments, clips of the exchange were already being uploaded online, ready to ignite a firestorm far beyond the marble walls of Congress. Social media exploded almost instantaneously. Twitter, X, and TikTok feeds flooded with snippets of the takedown, accompanied by commentary ranging from admiration to incredulity. Hashtags trended in minutes. Hashtag Crockett clapback. Hashtag mic drop moment. Hashtag Lee exposed. Memes began to circulate, juxtaposing Lee's smirk against Crockett's composure, highlighting the stark contrast between entitlement and truth. The conversation was no longer confined to the chamber. It was happening everywhere, on every device, in every corner of the country. Commentators and political analysts weighed in immediately, dissecting not only the words but the strategy behind them. Pundits acknowledged the rarity of a freshman congresswoman delivering such a precise, impactful blow against a veteran senator. Television panels replayed the clip, slow motion, frame by frame, discussing how Crockett had maintained her composure under provocation, her timing flawless, her message crystal clear. Even conservative commentators, some reluctantly, praised her poise and skill, acknowledging that the exchange had exposed a vulnerability in Lee they had previously overlooked. Celebrities and influencers joined the chorus, amplifying the moment to audiences that might never follow congressional proceedings. Tweets from prominent figures praised Crockett's courage, sharing the clip widely and framing it as a victory for authenticity, integrity, and unflinching truth-telling. Viral posts were accompanied by commentary celebrating representation and the symbolic power of a Black woman standing tall in the face of entrenched authority. Within hours, the takedown had become a national story. News outlets covered it with headlines designed to capture the drama. Crockett shuts down Lee in stunning display of poise. Freshman Congresswoman exposes veteran senator's arrogance. And one sentence, total collapse. Every coverage angle reinforced the narrative. This wasn't just a verbal skirmish. It was a reckoning, a moment that reminded America who had long been underestimated in its halls of power. And yet, the most striking aspect wasn't the applause, the memes, or the viral clips. Even the intense media scrutiny, the debates over the implications, and the late-night talk show references were only part of the story. The true significance lay in the energy it sparked, the conversations it inspired, and the validation it gave to people who had long been told to wait their turn, to be quiet, to accept their place. Because this moment didn't just go viral. It resonated. It rippled outward, connecting viewers to a broader narrative about power, representation, and the courage to speak truth in spaces designed to intimidate. For many, Crockett's victory in that chamber was a mirror of their own struggles, proof that one voice, delivered with clarity and conviction, can challenge even the most entrenched authority. But the real impact wasn't just the memes, it was the movement it fueled. 8. The resolution that when the echoes of the chamber finally settled, the true victory became clear, not in applause or viral clips, but in the principle Crockett had embodied. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win a debate. She transformed a moment of conflict into a lesson for the nation. She reframed the confrontation, turning what some might have seen as a personal victory into a universal truth. Dignity always outweighs arrogance, and truth always outlasts hypocrisy. In her composure and clarity, Crockett reminded everyone that courage isn't about volume or intimidation. It's about standing firm when the world expects you to bend. The symbolism was unmistakable. Here was a young Black woman, a freshman in Congress, rising to challenge one of the establishment's long-standing figures. Every glance, every pause, every carefully measured word carried the weight of centuries of voices that had been silenced. Her victory was not just her own. It belonged to anyone who had been underestimated, dismissed, or marginalized. Representation, she showed, is far more than a statistic. It is the power to demand accountability, to hold authority to its promises, and to prove that integrity cannot be overshadowed by tenure or privilege. Crockett's triumph also illuminated the broader moral landscape. Arrogance, no matter how polished, is brittle when confronted with truth. Authority, when untethered from accountability, can crumble under the scrutiny of a single voice willing to speak boldly. In the chamber that day, Lee's long-standing dominance was exposed not through spectacle or aggression, but through a calm, precise assertion of principle. For viewers across the country, this was validation. One person, speaking their truth, can challenge systems designed to maintain inequality and silence dissent. The lesson extends beyond the walls of Congress. It resonates with anyone who has faced condescension, mockery, or the burden of being underestimated. Crockett's moment becomes a blueprint for resilience. Observe, listen, calculate, and respond with clarity. The timing, the choice of words, the refusal to escalate unnecessarily. These are all elements of a moral power that doesn't need theatrics to be felt. It is power rooted in authenticity, earned through experience, and amplified by courage to eye in the larger story of democracy. This confrontation serves as a reminder that power is not absolute. It is contingent on respect, accountability, and the willingness of those in authority to be challenged. Crockett's line, simple yet devastating, carried the weight of this truth. It was a moment where a freshman legislator not only defended her own dignity, but reasserted the broader principle that justice and integrity must guide the use of authority. By the end, the crescendo of inspiration was unmistakable. Across living rooms, offices, and screens nationwide, people absorbed the message. Standing up for what is right is never wasted, and one well-timed, principled response can dismantle even the most entrenched arrogance. The chamber had witnessed a rare convergence of poise, intelligence, and courage, and the reverberations were felt far beyond those walls that I in that chamber. One voice reminded America that truth still echoes louder than power. 9. Outro. Mike Lee came into that chamber brimming with confidence, armed with years of experience, polished rhetoric, and the smug assurance of authority. But one savage line from Jasmine Crockett left him speechless, unraveling the carefully constructed image of dominance he had cultivated over decades. In that instant, it wasn't just a political exchange. It was a lesson in the enduring power of truth, courage, and dignity. This moment reminds us all that arrogance, no matter how loud or long-standing, can be dismantled when met with clarity and principle. It reaffirms that representation matters, that voices often underestimated carry the power to reshape narratives, challenge hypocrisy, and inspire a nation. Crockett's stand was more than a rebuttal. It was a demonstration that integrity and conviction are forces that no title or tenure can suppress. And the lesson doesn't stop at Congress. It extends to every individual who has ever felt silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. It's a call to action, a proof that speaking your truth, even in the face of intimidation, can create ripples far beyond the immediate moment. It's about holding power accountable, demanding fairness, and refusing to shrink in spaces designed to marginalize you. That if you believe truth can silence arrogance, share this video. Let it inspire conversations, amplify voices, and remind others that standing up matters. Subscribe and join the movement, because voices like Jasmine Crockett's must never be silenced. Be part of the momentum that celebrates courage, demands accountability, and proves that in every arena, dignity and truth can prevail. The chamber may have been the stage, but the impact resonates everywhere. One voice, spoken with precision and courage, can echo farther than anyone ever imagined.